Hi guys, so in my previous video about the assumptions involved in Plato's account of Atlantis, I pointed out the assumption that when Plato referred to the boundless continent surrounding the true sea, or true ocean as some other translations put it, that was the same sea that Atlantis was in, the Atlantic Sea. That's the assumption that's made, but Plato never actually says that that was the case. Now, I saw this in a book that promoted the Minoan theory, the idea that Atlantis was actually the Minoan civilization on Crete and Santorini. Now, the theory that I saw in that book, which I think was a really amazing theory, is that the Pillars of Heracles were actually at the entrance to the Black Sea, and the true sea was the Black Sea. And so when Plato referred to Atlantis being in front of the Pillars of Heracles, he wasn't actually saying that it was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, but just that it was in front of it, inside the Pillars of Heracles. And I thought that was such a fascinating theory, but it doesn't quite work, because Plato does definitely refer to the war between Athens and Atlantis as being a war between those inside and those outside the Pillars of Heracles. Whereas if we place those pillars at the entrance to the Black Sea, neither the Greeks nor the Minoans were outside or on the other side of those pillars from each other. So that doesn't quite work. However, I believe I have devised an explanation for Atlantis, for the Minoan theory, that explains everything in Plato's text regarding the location of Atlantis. So, Plato describes how the island of Atlantis was in front of the Pillars of Heracles, and he also refers to the fact that the war between Athens and Atlantis was a war between those outside and those inside the Pillars of Heracles. And he also refers to some of the Mediterranean nations like Egypt, Libya, Europe as far as Tyrrhenia in Italy, as being inside the Pillars of Heracles. So that would suggest that the Mediterranean Sea was viewed as being inside the Pillars of Heracles in Plato's account. Now, on the surface, that seems to make it impossible for Atlantis to have been inside the Mediterranean Sea, in view of the statement that the war was a war between those inside and those outside. Atlantis would have to be outside, right? Now, I think that's the key assumption, which pretty much everyone has made, but which is not the case. So it's not just that Atlantis was inside the Pillars of Heracles, it's that the Greeks were outside. Now think about this. In the Critias, there's the line where the speaker, Critias, refers in the context of what the Egyptian priest had described. He refers to the war between those outside and those inside the Pillars of Heracles. And then in the immediately following line, he states that on one side there were the men of Athens, and on the other side there were the men of Atlantis. Now, all other things being equal, in the absence of any preconceived ideas, just focusing on that statement there, the natural assumption, the most logical assumption, would be that the same order is followed. So the first sentence says it was a war between those outside and those inside the Pillars of Heracles. The following line says, on one side there were the men of Athens, on the other side there were the men of Atlantis. So the most natural logical conclusion is that the same order is being followed, just like how those outside the Pillars of Heracles are mentioned first. Then in the following sentence, it starts with, on one side there were the men of Athens. Logically, it follows the same order. And then just how the second opponent that's mentioned are those inside the Pillars of Heracles. And then in the following sentence, it says on the other side there were the men of Athens. Logically, the same order is being followed in the absence of any reason to think otherwise, which would mean that the Greeks were the ones who were outside the Pillars of Heracles, whereas the Atlanteans were those inside. Now, you might be thinking, how could this account from Plato possibly describe the Greeks themselves as being outside the Pillars of Heracles, when the Pillars of Heracles refer to the limits of Greek geographical knowledge or Greek activity? Well, the key issue is that this was an account which, according to Plato, came from the Egyptians, not from the Greeks. So from the perspective of the Egyptians, we know from Egyptian records that the Greeks were basically the limit of their geographical knowledge. And we know also that the Pillars of Heracles were applied to various different locations, principally to locations at each of the 4 cardinal directions, including the south, including at the Gulf of Laconia, which is the southernmost part of Greek territory, mainland Greek territory. So with that being the case, if the Pillars of Heracles were at the southernmost part of Greek territory, then from the perspective of the Egyptians, where that southernmost marker is also near enough the edge of their geographical knowledge, then the Greeks would be outside the Pillars of Heracles, whereas to the Egyptians, they are inside. Obviously, with any geographical marker, the speaker is, from their own perspective, inside the boundaries, and those on the other side are outside. That's the natural perspective of someone who is the speaker of a story. So the Egyptians who were describing this story, they were relating this story, they refer to the Greeks as outside the Pillars of Heracles, whereas everything within the Mediterranean is inside, because the Pillars of Heracles are at the very border of the southernmost limits of Greek territory. So they and the Atlanteans and everyone else, they're all inside. Now, the fact that Plato's account says that Atlantis tried to conquer all the territory inside the Pillars of Heracles doesn't mean that Atlantis itself was not also inside the Pillars of Heracles. We talk about nations all the time as being doing things inside the Pillars of Heracles without that contradicting the notion that they were also inside the Mediterranean. Now, you might be thinking, well, what about the true sea and the harbour-like sea? How does that work? Well, in this theory of mine, this scenario that I've devised, I maintain that other researchers' theory that the true sea was the Black Sea. So here's another assumption. Plato never says that the Black Sea was on the other side of the Pillars of Heracles, just that it was not inside those pillars. So it was outside, but that doesn't mean it was through, like directly on the other side of those pillars. So if we imagine the pillars, which are figurative by the way, the pillars denote the southernmost point of Greek territory. So the Mediterranean is inside. The Mediterranean is the harbour-like sea. The true sea is the Black Sea, which is outside the Pillars of Heracles, but not beyond in the sense of straight through. It's just somewhere else. So that's not inside the Pillars of Heracles, but it's not through it either. It's just elsewhere. So from Atlantis, from Minoan Crete, you arrive to, well, it's the way to several other islands, and then from those islands you get to the opposite continent, which is Asia Minor, or Anatolia. Now that is the boundless continent which surrounds the true ocean. Not that Anatolia, just Anatolia is the boundless continent, it's all of Asia and the easternmost part of Europe. So that's the boundless continent which surrounds the true ocean. The true ocean is the Black Sea, or the true sea. Plato doesn't actually use the word ocean, he uses the word pontos. Now pontos actually is the same word that came to be the name of the Black Sea. Now it's a word which just means sea. Think about that. The Greeks used the word for sea to mean the Black Sea. They used that as the name of the Black Sea. Now why would you use the normal common noun for sea as the name of a particular body of water? Well, evidently because that body of water came to be viewed as the definitive sea, the definitive pontos. So it was the pontos, the sea. So when Plato refers to the true sea, he's referring to the Pontos, the Black Sea. But in what way could it be a true sea in comparison to a harbour-like sea? Didn't Plato mean that the Mediterranean Sea was small in comparison to the enormous Atlantic Sea? Well, no, that's an assumption that's not actually explicitly stated in the text. He compares the true sea to what's evidently the Mediterranean Sea, which he compares to a harbour, but that doesn't mean he's talking necessarily about the size. See, as well as the size being different between a sea and a harbour, they're also different in other senses. It could be that Plato was describing the quality or the type of sea. Now we know that another early name for the Black Sea was the inhospitable sea. So if it was inhospitable, then logically that means it was inhospitable in comparison to the sea which the Greeks were more commonly used to, which was the Mediterranean Sea. So the Mediterranean Sea, in comparison, was a much safer place for ships compared to the Black Sea, which was inhospitable. So what is a harbour? Well, a harbour is a safe place for ships. And in comparison to the Black Sea, that really does describe the Mediterranean. The coasts, for example, are relatively safe. It's full of islands, which are places for ships to arrive at and take shelter at. They don't need to just sail across the grand open sea in danger most of the time. Obviously, there are dangerous parts of it, but in comparison to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean is much, much safer, which is why the Greeks called it the inhospitable sea. See, in the Black Sea, there are virtually no islands at all. It's just one massive body of water. Even though it's smaller than the Mediterranean, it feels much bigger because there are no islands around. It's just one big, open, scary, inhospitable body of water. Storms can just appear very suddenly, and even the coasts are not anywhere near as safe as the coasts of the Mediterranean. So the Black Sea is the true sea, surrounded by a boundless continent. And the Mediterranean is the harbour-like sea, not because of its size, but because of the quality, the type of sea. So when Plato described Atlantis being in front of the Pillars of Heracles, he meant that the Minoan Crete was in front of the figurative Pillars of Heracles in the southernmost part of Crete. Now, it was the way to other islands from which you get to the boundless continent going in that direction, not this direction, where it surrounds the Black Sea. The Black Sea is the true sea, the Mediterranean is the harbour-like sea because it's relatively safe for ships. So when the Egyptians were describing where it was, that there was this island and it was the way to other islands, and from there you'd get to the opposite continent which surrounds the true sea, that was just a logical description of Crete, which was in front of the southernmost border of Greece, and it was the way to other islands from which you would indeed get to the opposite continent which surrounds the true sea. So according to my theory, there are no errors or exaggerations or corruptions in the text in Plato's account. It all just accurately fits Minoan Crete. Now, there are still a few questions like, what about the Atlantic Sea? Why is it called the Atlantic Sea if it's the Mediterranean? And what about the fact it was said to have been bigger than Libya and Asia put together? Well, those also aren't mistakes or corruptions or anything like that, but I'll explain those in a future video.